"I dare say we shall manage it," replied Act Aeon. "We must do our best," said Tom. "Can I help?" inquired Jack. "Of course you can," answered Dick. "Run along to the wheel and assist Bat." Jack strutted off, proud enough of his commission. Under Dick's directions, the Negroes commenced their somewhat difficult task. The new topsail, rolled up, had first of all to be hoisted, and then to be made fast to the yard. But so adroitly did the crew carry out their orders, that in less than an hour the sail was properly set and flying with a couple of reefs. The foresail and second jib, which had been taken down before the tempest, were hoisted again, and before 10 o'clock, the Pilgrim was running along under the three sails, which Dick considered were as much as it was prudent to carry. Even at her present speed, the schooner, he reckoned, would be within sight of the American shore in about 10 days. It was an immense relief to him to find that she was no longer at the mercy of the waves, and when he saw the sails properly set he returned in good spirits to his post at the helm, not forgetting to thank the temporary helmsman for his services, nor omitting his acknowledgment to Master Jack, who received the compliment with becoming gravity. Although the clouds continued to travel all the next day with great rapidity, they were very much broken, and alternately the Pilgrim was bathed in sunlight and enveloped in vapors, which rolled on towards the east. As the weather cleared, the hatchways were opened in. Illustration: they both examined the outspread chart. Order to ventilate the ship, and the outer air was allowed again to penetrate not only the hold, but the cabin and crew's quarters. The wet sails were hung out to dry, the deck was washed down, for Dick Sands was anxious not to bring his ship into port without having finished her toilet, and he found that his crew could very well spare a few hours daily to get her into proper trim. Notwithstanding the loss of the log, Dick had sufficient experience to be able to make an approximate estimate of the schooner's progress, and after having pointed out to Mrs. Weldon what he imagined was the Pilgrim's true position, he told her that it was his firm impression that land would be sighted in little more than a week. "And upon what part of South America do you reckon we are likely to find ourselves?" she asked. "That is more than I dare venture to promise," replied Dick, "but I should think somewhere hereabouts." He was pointing on the chart to the long shoreline of Chile and Peru. They both examined the outspread chart with still closer attention. "Here you see," resumed Dick, "here is the island we have just left. We left it in the west. The wind has not shifted. We must expect to come in sight of land, pretty nearly due east of it. The coast has plenty of harbors. From any one of them you will be able easily to get to San Francisco. You know, I dare say, that the Pacific Navigation Company's steamers touch at all the principal ports. From any of them you will be sure to get direct passage to California." "But do you mean," asked Mrs. Weldon, "that you are not going yourself to take the schooner to San Francisco?" "Not direct," replied the young captain. "I want to see you safe on shore and satisfactorily on your homeward way. When that is done, I shall hope to get competent officers to take the ship to Valparaiso, where she will discharge her cargo, as Captain Hull intended, and afterwards I shall work our way back to San Francisco." "Ah well, we will see all about that in due time," Mrs. Weldon said, smiling, and after a short pause added, "At one time, Dick, you seemed to have rather a dread of the shore." "Quite true," answered Dick. "But now I am in hopes we may fall in with some passing vessel. We want to have a confirmation as to our true position. I cannot tell you how surprised I am that we have not come across a single vessel, but when we near the land we shall be able to get a pilot." "But what will happen if we fail to get a pilot?" was Mrs. Weldon's inquiry. She was anxious to learn how far the lad was prepared to meet any emergency. With unhesitating promptness Dick replied, "Why then, unless the weather takes the control of the ship out of my hands, I must patiently follow the coast until I come to a harbor of refuge. But if the wind should freshen, I should have to adopt other measures." "What then, Dick, what then?" persisted Mrs. Weldon. The boy's brow knitted itself together in resolution, and he said deliberately, "I should run the ship aground." Mrs. Weldon started. "However," Dick continued, "there is no reason to apprehend this. The weather has mended and is likely to mend, and why should we fear about finding a pilot? Let us hope all will be well." Mrs. Weldon at least had satisfied herself on one point. She had ascertained that, although Dick did not anticipate disaster, yet he was prepared in the case of emergency to resort to measures from which any but the most experienced seaman would shrink. But although Dick's equanimity had been successful in allaying any misgivings on Mrs. Weldon's part, it must be owned that the condition of the atmosphere caused him very serious uneasiness. The wind remained uncomfortably high, and the barometer gave very ominous indications that it would ere long freshen still more. Dick dreaded that the time was about to return in which once again he must reduce his vessel to a state of bare poles. But so intense was his aversion to having his ship so wrested as it were from his own management, that he determined to carry the topsail till it was all but carried away by the force of the blast. Concerned, moreover, for the safety of his masts, the loss of which he acknowledged must be fatal, he had the shrouds well overhauled and the backstays considerably tightened. More than once another contingency occurred to his mind, and gave him some anxiety. He could not overlook the possibility of the wind changing all round. What should he do in such a case? He would of course endeavor by all means to get the schooner on by incessant tacking, but was there not the certainty of a most hazardous delay? And worse than this, was there not a likelihood of the Pilgrim being once again driven far out to sea? Happily these forebodings were not realized. The wind, after chopping about for several days, at one time blowing from the north, and at another from the south, finally settled down into a stiffish gale from the west, which did nothing worse than severely strain the masts. In this weary but hopeful endurance time passed on. The 5th of April had arrived. It was more than 2 months since the Pilgrim had quitted New Zealand. It was true that during the first 3 weeks of her voyage she had been impeded by protracted calms and contrary winds. But since that time her speed had been rapid, the very tempests had driven her forwards with unwonted velocity. She had never failed to have her bow towards the land, and yet land seemed as remote as ever. The coastline was retreating as they approached it. What could be the solution of the mystery? From the crosstrees, one or other of the negroes was kept incessantly on the watch. Dick Sands himself, telescope in hand, would repeatedly ascend in the hope of beholding some lofty peak of the Andes emerging from the mists that hung over the horizon. But all in vain. False alarms were given more than once. Sometimes Tom, sometimes Hercules, or one of the others would be sure that a distant speck they had descried was assuredly a mountain ridge. But the vapors were continually gathering in such fantastic forms that their unexperienced eyes were soon deceived, and they seldom had to wait long before their fond delusion was all dispelled. At last the expected longing was fulfilled. At 8 o'clock one morning, the mist seemed broken up with unusual rapidity, and the horizon was singularly clear. Dick had hardly gone aloft when his voice rung out. "Land, land ahead." As if summoned by a spell, everyone was on deck in an instant. Mrs. Weldon, sanguine of a speedy end to the general anxiety, little Jack, gratified at a new object of curiosity, Cousin Benedict, already scenting a new field for entomological investigation, old Nan and the negroes, eager to set foot upon American soil. All, with the exception of Negoro, all were on deck. But the cook did not stir from his solitude, or betray any sympathy with the general excitement. Whatever hesitation there might be at first soon passed away. One after another soon distinguished the shore they were approaching, and in half an hour there was no room for the most skeptical to doubt that Dick was right. There was land not far ahead. A few miles to the east there was a long, low-lying coast. The chain of the Andes ought to be visible, but it was obscured, of course, by the intervening clouds. The Pilgrim bore down rapidly towards the land, and in a short time its configuration could be plainly made out. Towards the northeast the coast terminated in a headland of moderate height, sheltering a kind of roadstead. On the southeast it stretched out in a long and narrow tongue. The Andes were still wanting to the scene. They must be somewhere in the background. But at present, strange to say, there was only a succession of low cliffs with some trees standing out against the sky. No human habitation, no harbor, not even an indication of a river mouth, could anywhere be seen. The wind remained brisk, and the schooner was driving directly towards the land, with sails shortened as seemed desirable, but Dick realized to himself the fact that he was utterly incapable of altering her course. With eager eyes he scrutinized his situation. Straight ahead was a reef over which the waves were curling, and around which the surf must be tremendous. It could hardly be more than a mile away. The wind seemed brisker than before. After gazing a while, Dick seemed to have come to a sudden resolution. He went quickly aft and took the helm. He had seen a little cove and had made up his mind that he would try and make his way into it. He did not speak a word. He knew the difficulty of the task he had undertaken. He was aware from the white foam that there was shallow water on either hand, but he kept the secret of the peril to himself and sought no counsel in coming to his fixed resolve. Dingo had been trotting up and down the deck. All at once he bounded to the fore and broke out into a piteous howl. It roused Dick from his anxious cogitations. Was it possible that the animal recognized the coast? It almost seemed as if it brought back some painful associations. The howling of the dog had manifestly attracted Negoro's attention. The man emerged from his cabin and, regardless of the dog, stood close to the netting. But although he gazed at the surf, it did not seem to occasion him any alarm. Mrs. Weldon, who was watching him, fancied she saw a flush rise to his face, which involuntarily suggested the thought to her mind that Negoro had seen the place before. Either she had no time or no wish to express what had struck her, for she did not mention it to Dick, who, at that moment, left the helm and came and stood beside her. Dick looked as if he were taking a lingering farewell of the cove past, which they were being carried beyond his power to help. In a few moments, he turned round to Mrs. Weldon and said quietly, "Mrs. Weldon, I am disappointed. I hoped to get the schooner into yonder cove, but there is no chance now. If nothing is done, in half an hour she will be upon that reef. I have but one alternative left. I must run her aground. It will be utter destruction to the ship, but there is no choice. Your safety is the first and paramount consideration." "Do you mean that there is no other course to be taken, Dick?" "None whatever," said Dick decidedly. "It must be as you will," she said. Forthwith ensued the agitating preparations for stranding. Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Cousin Benedict, and Nan were provided with life belts, while Dick and the Negroes made themselves ready for being dashed into the waves. Every precaution that the emergency admitted was duly taken. Mrs. Weldon was entrusted to the special charge of Hercules. Dick made himself responsible for doing all he could for little Jack. Cousin Benedict, who was tolerably calm, was handed over to Bat and Austin, while Act Aeon promised to look after Nan. Negoro's nonchalance implied that he was quite capable of shifting for himself. Dick had the forethought also to order about a dozen barrels of their cargo to be brought in front, so that when the Pilgrim struck, the oil escaping and floating on the waves would temporarily lull their fury and make smoother water for the passage of the ship. After satisfying himself that there was no other measure to be taken to ameliorate the peril, Dick Sands returned to the helm. The schooner was all but upon the reef, and only a few cables' length from the shore. Her starboard quarter, indeed, was already bathed in the seething foam, and any instant the keel might be expected to grate upon the underlying rock. Presently a change of color in the water was observed. It revealed a passage between the rocks. Dick gave the wheel a turn. He saw the chance of getting aground nearer to the shore than he had dared to hope, and he made the most of it. He steered the schooner right into the narrow channel. The sea was. Illustration: the sea was furious and dashed vehemently upon the crags on either hand. Furious and dashed vehemently upon the crags on either hand. "Now, my lads," he cried to his crew, "now's your time, out with your oil, let it run." Ready for the order, the Negroes poured out the oil, and the raging waters were stilled as if by magic. A few moments more and perchance they would rage more vehemently than ever, but for the instant they were lulled. The Pilgrim, meanwhile, had glided onwards and made dead for the adjacent shore. There was a sudden shock. Caught by an enormous wave, the schooner had been hurled aground. Her masts had fallen, fortunately without injury to anyone on board. But the vessel had parted amidships and was foundering. The water was rushing irresistibly into the hold. The shore, however, was not half a cable's length away. There was a low, dark ridge of rocks that was united to the beach. It afforded ample means of rescue, and in less than 10 minutes the Pilgrim's captain, crew, and passengers were all landed, with their lives, at the foot of the overhanging cliff. Chapter 14. Ashore. Thus, after a voyage of 74 days, the Pilgrim had stranded. Mrs. Weldon and her fellow voyagers joined in thanksgiving to the kind providence that had brought them ashore, not upon one of the solitary islands of Polynesia, but upon a solid continent, from almost any part of which there would be no difficulty in getting home. The ship was totally lost. She was lying in the surf a hopeless wreck, and few must be the hours that would elapse before she would be broken up in scattered fragments. It was impossible to save her. Notwithstanding that Dick Sands bewailed the loss of a valuable ship and her cargo to the owner, he had the satisfaction of knowing that he had been instrumental in saving what was far more precious, the lives of the owner's wife and son. It was impossible to do more than hazard a conjecture as to the part of the South American coast on which the Pilgrim had been cast. Dick imagined that it must be somewhere on the coast of Peru. After sighting Easter Island, he knew that the united action of the equatorial current and the brisk wind must have had the effect of driving the schooner far northward, and he formed his conclusion. Accordingly, be the true position, however, what it might, it was all important that it should be accurately ascertained as soon as possible. If it were really in Peru, he would not be long in finding his way to one of the numerous ports and villages that lie along the coast. But the shore here was quite a desert. A narrow strip of beach, strewn with boulders, was enclosed by a cliff of no great height, in which, at irregular intervals, deep funnels appeared as chasms in the rock. Here and there a gentle slope led to the top. About a quarter of a mile to the north was the mouth of a little river which had not been visible from the sea. Its banks were overhung by a number of rhizophora, a species of mangrove entirely distinct from that indigenous to India. It was soon ascertained that the summit of the cliff was clothed by a dense forest, extending far away in undulations of verdure to the mountains in the background. Had Cousin Benedict been a botanist, he could not have failed to find a new and interesting field for his researches. There were lofty baobabs, to which an extraordinary longevity has often been erroneously ascribed, with bark resembling Egyptian syenite. There were white pines, tamarinds, pepper plants of peculiar species, and numerous other plants unfamiliar to the eye of a native of the north. But strange to say, there was not a single specimen of the extensive family of palms, of which more than 1,000 varieties are scattered in profusion in so many quarters of the globe. Above the shore hovered a large number of screeching birds, mostly of the swallow tribe, their black plumage shot with steely blue, and shading off to a light brown at the top of the head. Now and then a few partridges of a grayish color rose on wing, their necks entirely bare of feathers. The fearless manner in which the various birds all allowed themselves to be approached made Mrs. Weldon and Dick both wonder if the shores upon which they had been thrown were not so deserted that the sound of firearms was not known. On the edge of the reefs, some pelicans of the species known as Pelecanus minor were busily filling their pouches with tiny fish, and some gulls coming in from the open sea began to circle round the wreck. With these exceptions, not a living creature appeared in sight. Benedict, no doubt, could have discovered many entomological novelties amongst the foliage, but these could give no more information than the birds as to the name of their habitat. Neither north, nor south, nor towards the forest was there trace of rising smoke, or any footprint or other sign to indicate the presence of a human being. Dick's surprise was very great. He knew that the proximity of a native would have made Dingo bark aloud, but the dog gave no warning. He was running backwards and forwards, his tail lowered and his nose close to the ground. Now and again he uttered a deep growl. "Look at Dingo," said Mrs. Weldon. "How strange he is. He seems to be trying to discover a lost scent." After watching the dog for a time, she spoke again. "Look, too, at Negoro. He and the dog seem to be on the same purpose." "As to Negoro," said Dick, "I cannot concern myself with him now. He must do as he pleases. I have no further control over him. His service expires with the loss of the ship." Negoro was in fact walking to and fro, surveying the shore with the air of a man who was trying to recall some past experience to his recollection. His dogged taciturnity was too well known for anyone to think of questioning him. Everyone was accustomed to let him go his own way, and when Dick noticed that he had gone towards the little river and had disappeared behind the cliff, he thought no more about him. Dingo likewise had quite forgotten his enemy and desisted from his growling. The first necessity for the shipwreck party was to find a temporary shelter where they might take some refreshment. There was no lack of provisions. Independently of the resources of the land, the ebbing tide had left upon the rocks the great bulk of the Pilgrim's stores, and the Negroes had already collected several kegs of biscuit and a number of cases of preserved meat, besides a variety of other supplies. All that they rescued they carefully piled up above high water mark. As nothing appeared to be injured by the seawater, the victualling of the party all seemed to be satisfactorily secure for the interval which must elapse, and they all believed it would not be long. Illustration: surveying the shore with the air of a man who was trying to recall some past experience. Before they reached one of the villages which they presumed were close at hand, Dick, moreover, took the precaution of sending Hercules to get a small supply of fresh water from the river hard by, and the good-natured fellow returned carrying a whole barrelful on his shoulder. Plenty of fuel was lying about, and whenever they wanted to light a fire they were sure of having an abundance of dead wood and the roots of the old mangroves. Old Tom, an inveterate smoker, always carried a tinder box in his pocket. This had been too tightly fastened to be affected by the moisture, and could always produce a spark upon occasion. Still, they must have a shelter. Without some rest, it was impossible to start upon a tour of exploration. Accordingly, all interests were directed towards ascertaining where the necessary repose could be obtained. The honor of discovering where the desired retreat could be found fell to the lot of little Jack. Trotting about at the foot of the cliff, he came upon one of those grottos which are constantly being found hollowed out in the rock by the vehement action of the waves in times of tempest. "Here, look here," cried the child, "here's a place." "Well done, Jack," answered his mother. "Your lucky discovery is just what we wanted. If we were going to stay here any time, we should have to do the same as the Swiss family Robinson and name the spot after you." It was hardly more than 12 or 14 feet square, and yet the grotto seemed to Jack to be a gigantic cavern. But narrow as its limits were, it was capacious enough to receive the entire party. It was a great satisfaction to Mrs. Weldon to observe that it was perfectly dry, and as the moon was just about her first quarter, there was no likelihood of a tide rising to the foot of the cliff. At any rate, it was resolved that they might take up their quarters there for a few hours. Shortly after 1 o'clock, the whole party were seated upon a carpet of seaweed round a repast, consisting of preserved meat, biscuit, and water flavored with a few drops of rum, of which Bat had saved a quart bottle from the wreck. Even Negoro had returned and joined the group. Probably he had not cared to venture alone along the bank of the stream into the forest. He sat listening, as it seemed indifferently, to the various plans for the future that were being discussed, and did not open his mouth either by way of remonstrance or suggestion. Dingo was not forgotten, and had his share of food duly given him outside the grotto, where he was keeping guard. When the meal was ended, Mrs. Weldon, passing her arms round Jack, who was lounging half asleep with excitement and fatigue at her side, was the first to speak. "My dear Dick," she said, "in the name of us all, let me thank you for the services you have rendered us in our tedious time of difficulty. As you have been our captain at sea, let me beg you to be our guide upon land. We shall have perfect confidence in your judgment, and await your instructions as to what our next proceedings shall be." All eyes were turned upon Dick. Even Negoro appeared to be roused to curiosity, as if eager to know what he had to say. Dick did not speak for some moments. He was manifestly pondering what step he should advise. After a while he said, "My own impression, Mrs. Weldon, is that we have been cast ashore upon one of the least frequented parts of the coast of Peru, and that we are near the borders of the Pampas. In that case, I should conclude that we are at a considerable distance from any village. Now, I should recommend that we stay here altogether for the coming night. Tomorrow morning, 2 of us can start off on an exploring expedition. I entertain but little doubt that natives will be met with within 10 or a dozen miles." Mrs. Weldon looked doubtful. Plainly she thought unfavorably of the project of separating the party. She reflected for a considerable time, and then asked, "And who is to undertake the task of exploring?" Prompt was Dick's answer. "Tom and I." "And leave us here," suggested the lady. "Yes, to take care of you, there will be Hercules, Bat, Act Aeon, and Austin. Negoro too, I presume, means to remain here," said Dick, glancing towards the cook. "Perhaps," replied Negoro, sparing as ever of his words. "We shall take Dingo," added Dick. "Likely enough he may be useful." At the sound of his name, the dog had entered the grotto. A short bark seemed to testify his approval of Dick's proposal. Mrs. Weldon was silent. She looked sad and thoughtful. It was hard to reconcile herself to the division of the party. She was aware that the separation would not be for long, but she could not suppress a certain feeling of nervousness. Was it not possible that some natives, attracted by the wreck, would assault them in hopes of plunder? Every argument he could think of, Dick brought forward to reassure the lady. He told her that the Indians were perfectly harmless and entirely different to the savage tribes of Africa and Polynesia. There was no reason to apprehend any mischief, even if they should chance to encounter them, which was itself extremely unlikely. No doubt the separation would have its inconveniences, but they would be insignificant compared with the difficulty of traversing the country en masse. Tom and he would have far greater freedom if they went alone, and could make their investigations much more thoroughly. Finally, he promised that if within 2 days they failed to discover human habitation, they would return to the grotto forthwith. I confess, however, he added, that I have little expectation of being able to ascertain our true position until I have penetrated some distance into the country. There was nothing in Dick's representations but what commanded Mrs. Weldon's assent as reasonable. It was simply her own nervousness, she acknowledged, that made her hesitate, but it was only with extreme reluctance that she finally yielded to the proposition. "And what, Mr. Benedict, is your opinion of my proposal?" said Dick, turning to the entomologist. "I," answered Cousin Benedict, looking somewhat bewildered. "Oh, I am agreeable to anything. I dare say I shall find some specimens. I think I will go and look at once." "Take my advice, and don't go far away," replied Dick. "All right, I shall take care of myself." "And don't be bringing back a lot of mosquitoes," said old Tom mischievously. With his box under his arm, the naturalist left the grotto. Negoro followed almost immediately. He did not take the same direction as Benedict up the cliff, but for the second time bent his steps towards the river and proceeded along its bank till he was out of sight. It was not long before Jack's exertions told upon him, and he fell into a sound sleep. Mrs. Weldon, having gently laid him on Nan's lap, wandered out and made her way to the water's edge. She was soon joined by Dick and the Negroes, who wanted to see whether it was possible to get to the Pilgrim and secure any articles that might be serviceable for future use. The reef on which the schooner had stranded was now quite dry, and the carcass of the vessel, which had been partially covered at high water, was lying in the midst of debris of the most promiscuous character. The wide difference between high and low water mark caused Dick Sands no little surprise. He knew that the tides on the shores of the Pacific were very inconsiderable. In his own mind, however, he came to the conclusion that the phenomenon was to be explained by the unusually high wind that had been blowing on the coast. Not without emotion could Mrs. Weldon, or indeed any of them, behold the unfortunate ship upon which they had spent so many eventful days, lying dismasted on her side. But there was little time for sentiment. If they wished to visit the hull before it finally went to pieces, there must be no delay. Hoisting themselves by some loose rigging that was hanging from the deck, Dick and several of the Negroes. Illustration: not without emotion could Mrs. Weldon, or indeed any of them, behold the unfortunate ship. Contrived to make their way into the interior of the hull. Dick left his men to gather together all they could in the way of food and drink from the storeroom, and himself went straight to the stern cabin, into which the water had not penetrated. Here he found 4 excellent Purdes Remington rifles and 100 cartridges. With these he determined to arm his party, in case they should be attacked by Indians. He also chose 6 of the strongest of the cutlasses that are used for slicing up dead whales, and did not forget the little toy gun which was Jack's special property. Unexpectedly, he found a pocket compass, which he was only too glad to appropriate. What a boon it would have been had he discovered it earlier. The ship's charts in the forecabin were too much injured by water to be of any further service. Nearly everything was either lost or spoiled, but the misfortune was not felt very acutely because there was ample provision for a few days, and it seemed useless to burden themselves with more than was necessary. Dick hardly needed Mrs. Weldon's advice to secure all the money that might be on board, but after the most diligent search, he failed to discover more than $500. This was a subject of perplexity. Mrs. Weldon herself had had a considerably larger sum than this, and Captain Hull was known always to keep a good reserve in hand. There was but one way to solve the mystery. Someone had been beforehand to the wreck. It could not be any of the Negroes, as not one of them had for a moment left the grotto. Suspicion naturally fell upon Negoro, who had been out alone upon the shore. Morose and cold-blooded as the man was, Dick hardly knew why he should suspect him of the crime of theft. Nevertheless, he determined to cross-examine him, and if need be, to have him searched, as soon as he came back. The day wore onwards to its close. The sun was approaching the vernal equinox and sank almost perpendicularly on to the horizon. Twilight was very short, and the rapidity with which darkness came on confirmed Dick in his belief that they had got ashore at some spot, lying between the Tropic of Capricorn and the equator. They all assembled in the grotto again, for the purpose of getting some sleep. "Another rough night coming on," said Tom, pointing to the heavy clouds that hung over the horizon. "No doubt, Tom," answered Dick, "and I think we may congratulate ourselves on being safe out of our poor ship." As the night could not be otherwise than very dark, it was arranged that the Negroes should take their turns in keeping guard at the entrance of the grotto. Dingo also would be upon the alert. Benedict had not yet returned. Hercules shouted his name with the full strength of his capacious lungs, and shortly afterwards the entomologist was seen making his way down the face of the cliff at the imminent risk of breaking his neck. He was in a great rage. He had not found a single insect worth having. Scorpions, scolopendra, and other myriapoda were in the forest in abundance, but not one of these, of course, could be allowed a place in his collection. "Have I come 6,000 miles for this?" he cried. "Have I endured storm and shipwreck only to be cast where not a hexapod is to be seen? The country is detestable. I shall not stay in it another hour." Ever gentle to his eccentricities, Mrs. Weldon soothed him as she would a child. She told him that he had better take some rest now, and most likely he would have better luck tomorrow. Cousin Benedict had hardly been pacified when Tom remarked that Negoro too had not returned. "Never mind," said Bat, "his room is as good as his company." "I cannot say that I altogether think so. The man is no favorite of mine, but I like him better under my own eye," said Mrs. Weldon. "Perhaps he has his own reasons for keeping away," said Dick, and taking Mrs. Weldon aside, he communicated to her his suspicions of the fellow's dishonesty. He found that she coincided with him in her view of. Illustration: the entomologist was seen making his way down the face of the cliff at the imminent risk of breaking his neck. Negoro's conduct, but she did not agree with him in his proposal to have him searched at once. If he returned, she should be convinced that he had deposited the money in some secret spot, and as there would be no proof of his guilt, it would be better to leave him, at least for a time, uninterrogated. Dick was convinced by her representations and promised to act upon her advice. Before they resigned themselves to sleep, they had repeatedly summoned Negoro back, but he either could not or would not hear. Mrs. Weldon and Dick scarcely knew what to think, unless he had lost his way. It was unaccountable why he should be wandering about alone on a dark night in a strange country. Presently Dingo was heard barking furiously. He had left the opening of the grotto and was evidently down at the water's edge. Imagining that Negoro must be coming, Dick sent 3 of the Negroes in the direction of the river to meet him, but when they reached the bank not a soul could be seen, and as Dingo was quiet again, they made their way back to the grotto. Excepting the man left on watch, they now all lay down, hoping to get some repose. Mrs. Weldon, however, could not sleep. The land for which she had sighed so ardently had been reached, but it had failed to give either the security or the comfort which she had anticipated. Chapter 15. A Stranger. At daybreak next morning, Austin, who happened to be on guard, heard Dingo bark and noticed that he started up and ran towards the river. Arousing the inmates of the grotto, he announced to them that someone was coming. "It isn't Negoro," said Tom. "Dingo would bark louder than that if Negoro were to be seen." "Who then can it be?" asked Mrs. Weldon with an inquiring glance towards Dick. "We must wait and see, madam," replied Dick quietly. Bidding Bat, Austin, and Hercules follow his example, Dick Sands took up a cutlass and a rifle, into the breech of which he slipped a cartridge. Thus armed, the 4 young men made their way towards the river bank. Tom and Act Aeon were left with Mrs. Weldon at the entrance of the grotto. The sun was just rising. Its rays, intercepted by the lofty range of mountains in the east, did not fall directly on the cliff, but the sea to its western horizon was sparkling in the sunbeams as the party marched along the shore. Dingo was motionless as a setter, but did not cease barking. It soon proved not to be his old enemy who was disturbing him. A man, who was not Negoro, appeared round the angle of the cliff, and advancing cautiously along the bank of the stream, seemed by his gestures to be endeavoring to pacify the dog, with which an encounter would certainly have been by no means desirable. "That's not Negoro," said Hercules. Illustration: "Good morning, my young friend." "No loss for any of us," muttered Bat. "You are right," replied Dick. "Perhaps he is a native. Let us hope he may be able to tell us our whereabouts and save us the trouble of exploring." With their rifles on their shoulders, they advanced steadily towards the new arrival. The stranger, on becoming aware of their approach, manifested great surprise. He was apparently puzzled as to how they had reached the shore, for the Pilgrim had been entirely broken up during the night, and the spars that were floating about had probably been too few and too scattered to attract his attention. His first attitude seemed to betray something of fear, and raising to his shoulder a gun that had been slung to his belt, he began to retrace his steps, but conciliatory gestures on the part of Dick quickly reassured him, and after a moment's hesitation, he continued to advance. He was a man of about 40 years of age, strongly built, with a keen, bright eye, grizzly hair and beard, and a complexion tanned as with constant exposure to the forest air. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, a kind of leather jerkin or tunic, and long boots reaching nearly to his knees. To his high heels was fastened a pair of wide-rolled spurs, which clanked as he moved. Dick Sands in an instant saw that he was not looking upon one of the roving Indians of the Pampas, but upon one of those adventurers, often of very doubtful character, who are not unfrequently to be met with in the remotest quarters of the earth. Clearly this was neither an Indian nor a Spaniard. His erect, not to say rigid deportment, and the reddish hue with which his hair and beard were streaked, betokened him to be of Anglo-Saxon origin, a conjecture which was at once confirmed when upon Dick's wishing him good morning, he replied in unmistakable English, with hardly a trace of foreign accent. "Good morning, my young friend." He stepped forward, and having shaken hands with Dick, nodded to all his companions. "Are you English?" he asked. "No, we are Americans," replied Dick. "North or south?" inquired the man. "North," Dick answered. The information seemed to afford the stranger no little satisfaction, and he again wrung Dick's hand with all the enthusiasm of a fellow countryman. "And may I ask what brings you here?" he continued. Before, however, Dick had time to reply, the stranger had courteously raised his hat, and looking round, Dick saw that his bow was intended for Mrs. Weldon, who had just reached the river-bank. She proceeded to tell him the particulars of how they had been shipwrecked, and how the vessel had gone to pieces on the reefs. A look of pity crossed the man's face as he listened, and he cast his eye, as it might be involuntarily, upon the sea, in order to discern some vestige of the stranded ship. "Ah, there is nothing to be seen of our poor schooner," said Dick mournfully. "The last of her was broken up in the storm last night." "And now," interposed Mrs. Weldon, "can you tell us where we are?" "Where?" exclaimed the man, with every indication of surprise at her question. "Why, on the coast of South America, of course." "But on what part? Are we near Peru?" Dick inquired eagerly. "No, my lad, no. You are more to the south. You are on the coast of Bolivia, close to the borders of Chile." "A good distance, I suppose, from Lima?" asked Dick. "From Lima, yes, a long way. Lima is far to the north." "And what is the name of that promontory?" Dick said, pointing to the adjacent headland. "That, I confess, is more than I am able to tell you," replied the stranger. "For although I have traveled a great deal in the interior of the country, I have never before visited this part of the coast." Dick pondered in thoughtful silence over the information he had thus received. He had no reason to doubt its accuracy. According to his own reckoning, he would have expected to come ashore somewhere between the latitudes of 27 degrees and degrees, and by this stranger's showing, he had made the latitude 25 degrees. The discrepancy was not very great. It was not more than might be accounted for by the action of the currents, which he knew he had been unable to estimate. Moreover, the deserted character of the whole shore inclined him to believe more easily that he was in Lower Bolivia. Whilst this conversation was going on, Mrs. Weldon, whose suspicions had been excited by Negoro's disappearance, had been scrutinizing the stranger with the utmost attention, but she could detect nothing either in his manner or in his words to give her any cause to doubt his good faith. "Pardon me," she said presently, "but you do not seem to me to be a native of Peru." No, like yourself, I am an American, Mrs. He paused, as if waiting to be told her name. The lady smiled and gave her name. He thanked her and continued. My name is Harris. I was born in South Carolina, but it is now 20 years since I left my home for the pampas of Bolivia. Imagine, therefore, how much pleasure it gives me to come across some countrymen of my own. Do you live in this part of the province, Mr. Harris? Mrs. Weldon asked. No, indeed, far away. I live down to the south, close to the borders of Chile. At present I am taking a journey northeastwards to Atacama. Atacama, exclaimed Dick. Are we anywhere near the desert of Atacama? Yes, my young friend, rejoined Harris. You are just on the edge of it. It extends far beyond those mountains which you see on the horizon, and is one of the most curious and least explored parts of the continent. And are you traveling through it alone? Mrs. Weldon inquired. Yes, quite alone, and it is not the first time I have performed the journey. One of my brothers owns a large illustration. He is my little son. Farm, the hacienda of San Feliz, about 200 miles from here, and I have occasion now and then to pay him business visits. After a moment's hesitation, as if he were weighing a sudden thought, he continued. I am on my way there now, and if you will accompany me, I can promise you a hearty welcome, and my brother will be most happy to do his best to provide you with means of conveyance to San Francisco. Mrs. Weldon had hardly begun to express her thanks for the proposal when he said abruptly, Are these Negroes your slaves? Slaves, sir, replied Mrs. Weldon, drawing herself up proudly. We have no slaves in the United States. The South has now long followed the example of the North. Slavery is abolished. I beg your pardon, madam. I had forgotten that the War of 1862 had solved that question, but seeing these fellows with you, I thought perhaps they might be in your service, he added, with a slight tone of irony. We are very proud to be of any service to Mrs. Weldon, Tom interposed with dignity, but we are no man's property. It is true I was sold for a slave when I was 6 years old, but I have long since had my freedom, and so has my son. That here and all his friends were born of free parents. Ah, well then, I have to congratulate you, replied Harris, in a manner that jarred very sensibly upon Mrs. Weldon's feelings, but she said nothing. Harris added, I can assure you that you are as safe here in Bolivia as you would be in New England. He had not finished speaking when Jack, followed by Nan, came out of the grotto. The child was rubbing his eyes, having only just awakened from his night's sleep. Catching sight of his mother, he darted towards her. What a charming little boy, exclaimed Harris. He is my little son, said Mrs. Weldon, kissing the child by way of morning greeting. Ah, madam, I am sure you must have suffered doubly on his account. Will the little man let me kiss him too? But there was something in the stranger's appearance that did not take Jack's fancy, and he shrank back timidly to his mother's side. You must excuse him, sir, he is very shy. Never mind, said Harris. We shall be better acquainted by and by. When we get to my brother's, he shall have a nice little pony to ride. But not even this tempting offer seemed to have any effect in coaxing Jack into a more genial mood. He kept fast hold of his mother's hand, and she, somewhat vexed at his behavior, and anxious that no offense should be given to a man who appeared so friendly in his intentions, hastened to turn the conversation to another topic. Meantime Dick Sands had been considering Harris's proposal. Upon the whole, the plan of making their way to the hacienda of San Feliz seemed to commend itself to his judgment, but he could not conceal from himself that a journey of 200 miles across plains and forests, without any means of transport, would be extremely fatiguing. On expressing his doubts on this point, he was met with the reply, Oh, that can be managed well enough, young man. Just round the corner of the cliff there I have a horse, which is quite at the disposal of the lady and her son, and by easy stages of 10 miles or so a day, it will do the rest of us no harm to travel on foot. Besides, he added, when I spoke of the journey being 200 miles, I was thinking of following, as I usually do, the course of the river, but by taking a short cut across the forest, we may reduce the distance by nearly 80 miles. Mrs. Weldon was about to say how grateful she was, but Harris anticipated her. Not a word, madam, I beg you. You cannot thank me better than by accepting my offer. I confess I have never crossed this forest, but I am so much accustomed to the pampas that I have little fear of losing my way. The only difficulty is in the matter of provisions, as I have only supplied myself with enough to carry me on to San Felice." "As to provisions," replied Mrs. Weldon, "we have enough and to spare, and we shall be more than willing to share everything with you." "That is well," answered Harris. "Then there can be no reason why we should not start at once." He was turning away with the intention of fetching his horse, when Dick Sands detained him. True to his seaman's instincts, the young sailor felt that he should be much more at his ease on the seashore than traversing the heart of an unknown forest. "Pardon me, Mr. Harris," he began, "but instead of taking so long a journey across the desert of Atacama, would it not be far better for us to follow the coast either northwards or southwards, until we reach the nearest seaport?